Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Let me introduce myself. I'm Paul Rich. I run a management consultancy called Genesys Digital Transformation. And here, for the first time this morning on stage, we've got someone who's actually from a travel company, which is nice. We've had search engines, consultants, transport people. So Utpal, it's great to have you here. Your job title is Global Head of New Product Innovation. And that's at Carlson Wagonlit Travel, which is one of our most respected business corporate travel companies.
That's correct.
Yeah, but tell me, what does the Global Head of New Product Innovation do?
So essentially what we do at CWT is we have, as I said, a division called Innovation and New Product Development. And what that simply means is that we look at opportunities, technologies, startups, use cases that could either help improve the operational efficiency significantly or add a sustainable new revenue stream to CWT, or simply look at anything that could potentially disrupt this landscape 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. Then in the least would have a heads up and best case scenario will develop those capabilities so we don't get preempted. So that's essentially what I do.
Okay, and it was quite interesting this morning, especially I think when we started with Becky, we talked about moonshotting, and then we looked at Harge and Hyperloop. We were looking at, I said, huge leaps of innovation, but you actually work in a travel business that's been around a long time. And you just mentioned 5 to 10 year horizons here, but presumably for a travel company like CWT, is it more about incremental innovation?
So that's a very good question, John. So Paul, I apologize. So some amount of innovation is organic. Technically, if you improve any process, it is innovation. So you can't prevent that employees do that organically to make their jobs easier, faster, better. But for an organization to deliver a quantum leap in doing things that are enormously more efficient, you need to have a very disciplined approach. And I know it's, we all talk about the platitudes that all employees are innovators and stuff, which is true. Ideas can come from any source. Ideas essentially are source agnostic. The question is, once you have those ideas, then what happens? Organizations do not, for the most part, have the capability or a systemic process to harness all these ideas, look for things that are most achievable and scalable, and then put in place a process that will help them to see it to fruition. That's where the discipline comes in.
So should we think of you within CWT as one of these suggestion boxes with a little slot where employees are putting suggestions into you? Or is it your job to actually be looking forward and coming up with ideas and sponsoring them into the organization?
It is actually, we're not just a suggestion box. So as I said, the ideas can come from any source, from employee message boards, direct emails. We have partnerships with accelerators globally. We see on average about like 1,000 startups a year. Press, anything at all. Then what happens after that is we have a pretty elaborate process of scoring all of these ideas. All ideas are good ideas. The question is, which ones do you want to invest money in? So we have an elaborate process to score along several vectors, principally the degree of fit to our organization and business. The other is the relative value. And of course, value could be dollars and cents, so value could be defined some other way. And anything that scores very high on these two indices, then we essentially adopt into what we call an incubation cycle. We run minimum viable products or pilots, and if it is deemed to be scalable, then we put our entire muscle behind it to scale the product.
Yes, and you said we put our muscle behind it. I just wondered who the we might be, because in the last panel session, I think it was mentioned that innovation should be across a whole organization. But obviously you need someone to spearhead it, and that's your role. So if you're coming up with an idea that is scoring well, worth implementing, how do you get buy-in to that?
So that's actually another good question. CWT essentially works not exclusively with startups, but for most part with startups. And that essentially frees us from this onerous process of seeking a million buy-ins. Most of the development happens on the startup side, and what the value that we bring to startups is that anytime a startup talks to their investors that they have an active pilot with a large corporation, it does legitimize them. It also helps them get their product into a more closer product market fit. And then for CWT, it allows us to test 10, 20, 30 concepts in parallel without being tied down with the internal bureaucracy.
Okay, so we're talking about corporate travel,
Yes.
which is great, and I just wonder if you can maybe talk a bit about the kind of innovations that have been coming in. Because we were chatting outside before, and I think we're agreeing that actually the travel industry is actually very good at innovation.
Yeah, it's funny, not many people realize that we are a very old industry. And we don't get a lot of credit for being the early adopters of technology, but the truth is that travel is one of the very few industries that has historically been very, very open to adoption of technologies and changing things. And I'll give you a few examples. I know the panel earlier, the lady from Amadeus said about the facial recognition thing.
Yes.
Airports, airlines, they're probably the first movers in this field. Also, there's been enormous development in the field of AI, and of course, AI is a broad term. It can mean anything and everything, but the specific examples that I'd like to call upon related to travel is predictive analytics. So we now have the capability to predict with a very, very high degree of accuracy if your flight is going to be on time or delayed or canceled right at the time of booking, not simply by looking at the Weather Channel, but incorporating data from disparate sources like airspace crowding, runway availability, local events, and a whole bunch of other data points, and then come up with the score on how likely are you going to be able to fly on time or not. Now imagine the empowerment it creates for the traveler if I know a month in advance that my flight has an 80% chance of being delayed 3 hours or more, then I, as the traveler, have a choice either to take the risk or look at alternative options. And travel is, this is commonly available now. If you Google it, there are plenty of providers that do that. Also, we know for a fact that airfares and hotel rates are highly volatile. And you always are in this dilemma when you make a hotel booking or book a flight if you paid more than what that flight or hotel room is going to cost tomorrow. Now, with advances in predictive analytics and machine learning, we can essentially reverse engineer the pattern and predict if the airfare on any segment on any flight anywhere in the world is likely to go up or down, and if the ML platform returns a decision, it's highly likely to drop in price, then you simply delay the booking decision. Now, the beauty of this is that, in theory, hotel companies and airlines can adjust their algorithm accordingly, but the machine learning platform will self-correct as and when it observes that their predictions are deviant from the actual results. So, and these are technologies that are very, very empowering to the traveler and generally make travel a more pleasurable experience.
And these are the kind of innovations that you're bringing in to the benefit of your travelers?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, fine. Because that's fine. We're talking about predictive analytics, but we're also living in a very unstable world right now with extreme weather events, with extreme socio-economic events. And I just wonder whether there's something we can be doing in the way of technology innovation where you can help your travelers actually cope when there's a crisis.
Yes, so I guess your question falls in the realm of safety and security for the traveler.
Yeah.
There is, we are a TMC, CWT essentially, and what that simply means is we manage employee travel for corporations like Google and Amazon and so on. I mean, companies as large as that spend an enormous amount of money on employee travel. So we have a duty of care responsibility, not just by way of providing resources for them to help plan their travel and provide after-hours support. We also have to be able to provide them guidance on, in the event of an emergency, what to do. Now, there is a lot of startups that have come up in this space that specifically deal with safety and security, and some of these are big data platforms that scour the dark web, look at events plan, and based on that forecast the likelihood of any untoward incident, and then they have a very seamless way of notifying the traveler either ahead of time or at the event on what areas to avoid or what to do in case you get stuck, and also notify others from the company or any other known providers of services on where to deploy resources. So this is actually a very, very critical travel need.
Okay, and of course, corporate travel many years ago was, I suppose, very much a personal communication type medium. There'd be travel agents talking to clientele or talking to clientele's secretaries, booking agents for the travelers. And we've become more and more automated. And it's making me think that who the winners might be organizationally. There's big organizations like CWT that can actually afford to invest in innovation, which is fine. And then there's also very fleet of foot innovators who are coming in as startups with something very, very new and very sexy, and actually maybe 1 in 100, maybe 1 in 200 manage to establish themselves as businesses. Do you think that we're finding that the marketplace, so let's talk about corporate travel, might be polarizing between the big companies like CWT who have the financial muscle to innovate and keep ahead of the game for their customers, and the few startups who do succeed, and actually the middle ground is becoming a danger area? Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I mean, fundamentally, travel is a highly fragmented industry. If you discount the airlines, there is consolidation there, but the rest of the ecosystem is pretty fragmented. So there's always going to be space for people. Startups typically are more nimble, and they have their pulse to the ground, and you know, they can iterate faster. Now, of course, they don't have enough financial muscle, but that's the beauty. There is a drive because you have a runway that you have to essentially innovate or create a product before you hit the end of the runway force. So it forces decision making. Organizations typically, unless there is, as I mentioned, a disciplined approach and a dedicated focus, it gets a lot more difficult for them. But picking on the earlier point you mentioned about the winners and losers, I don't think there's a winner or loser kind of a thing, but I do want to call out, I see a lot of young professionals here for their benefit. A lot of jobs in the travel and distribution landscape that exists today may not be around 10, 15, 20 years from now, and these are things like front desk operations or call center operations, concierge, room service, order taker and stuff in the case of hotels. I hope they're still there, but the speed at which technology is moving and the speed at which businesses are adopting technologies like chatbots makes those functions very redundant, because a chatbot essentially can do all of those things very efficiently and very economically. So the question becomes then, what incremental value does a human add in those functions? So I would strongly urge the young professionals to acquiring skills beyond just these core functions.
Yes, and I mentioned to you just now about the personal one-to-one side of the travel business. And I saw a presentation just recently by David Speakman. Some of you will know him as the founder of Travel Counsellors. And what Travel Counsellors was all about was an individual counsellor going out and talking face-to-face with customers. Very personal, and that business has been very successful indeed. If we now move to some of the things we're talking about in innovation and automation, where with artificial intelligence you can actually create, maybe through technology, some kind of personal, emotional link with people. I'm exploring this idea because I'm actually going to run a conference called Let's Get Emotional, which is actually about technology creating emotion. You see this mostly when you're buying, Booking.com is a good example. When they're down to their last 2 rooms available in a hotel, they might flag up a message saying, 5 have been sold, only got 1 left. Buy now. There's some controversy about that kind of emotional statement to drive technology. I just wonder your thoughts, Utpal, on whether you think that actually artificial intelligence and technology and automation can actually make the emotional connection with individuals, or actually in the future there might be a backlash and we actually need to use communication because people do ultimately like to talk to people.
Yeah, so first and foremost, travel technology companies and technology companies in general are very, very good at assessing the emotion or the sentiment, and they call it sentiment analysis of the traveler, and they can run these multivariate testing literally 1,000,000 times a day to see what drives conversion. So the funny thing about this is that it's hard to predict what you are going to eat for dinner today, but it's a lot easier to predict that 70% of the people tonight are going to eat pasta, right? So things like this. So by running these user trials constantly, they're able to predict what is going to drive that emotion. In this case, this compelling message, last 2 rooms available, is a powerful driver of conversion. And I mean, you can call it controversial. I will not comment on that, but it's real and it's not going away. So the question is, how should we navigate this challenge, especially for startups or players that are new to the industry? You can't match dollar for dollar the wherewithal of a Booking.com to invest in those resources, but how do you navigate these challenges?
Yes, and I saw I forget which hotel chain it was. They have an AI concierge, which actually you reacted with via your texting. And apparently this concierge was so good that one of the guests checking out of the hotel gave the receptionist an envelope with £20 in and said, look, George, the concierge is so wonderful, please give this to him. And the receptionist said, well, actually, I have to tell you that the concierge was a piece of technology. It doesn't really exist, so he doesn't need £20. And the guest said, no, give the £20 anyway, buy some cables for him or whatever. And so technology was being used to actually create great personalization. But on the other hand, if we look at Generation Z that was mentioned earlier, for example, and Generation Alpha that'll come along shortly, they are getting very used to communicating worldwide with friends and acquaintances and putting their thoughts up online. And I just wonder whether automation is going to continue to work for us, or whether actually we still need this communication with people.
You can take anyone's view on that, but my personal view is that there is going to be a generational inflection point where you will see a sudden, huge adoption of digital channels, which is non-human channels, essentially. And we've seen this in the past. When mobile came along first, I used to be with Expedia in my previous life, and I think it was around the year 2009 or 2010. We had something like 1% of what the total traffic was through a mobile device, and we didn't even know we had a mobile device, a mobile website at that point of time. The apps were new. Fast forward 5 years, I think more than 60% of Expedia's travel was on a mobile device, and most of the travel now is essentially consumed via a mobile device in 5 short years. I do believe that we will see a similar inflection point or rapid escalation of adoption of digital technologies like chatbots that will essentially mean less and less human interaction.
Okay, and you may not want to talk about your personal experiences at CWT because it's a big company and there's confidentiality to worry about, but we're talking about delivering on the digital transformation of travel. You've got a very much an innovation hat on. I just wonder what your thoughts are on the most pressing challenges in being able to deliver digital transformation and innovation within a travel organization. Any thoughts on that?
So, and I'll answer this question generically for all travel
Yes, please do
companies.
that, yeah.
You know, travel is an old industry, and a lot of legacy companies are built on a business model or the technology stack or backend or even the processes that were conducive to running that business at some point of time. But it's very difficult for large corporations to move on a dime. So Thomas Cook is a very good example.
Yes.
It's not that they woke up one fine morning and then there was no money in the bank. It doesn't happen like that. The warning signals are there very early on, but then it's not easy to pivot for these companies. So the choice that they have to make is very painful. Either you take on a lot of debt and completely restructure, which essentially means starting a new company. The cheaper option then is to file bankruptcy and do that anyways. So unless you have a dedicated focus on innovation from very early on, outcomes like that become highly, highly likely for legacy corporations.
And just, I think we need to close now,
Sure.
Utpal. So just thinking 5 years ahead, do you think we'll still be sitting here talking about how to deliver digital transformation? Or do you think we'll sit here and say, you know what, guys, we did it?
I think it's a journey, but I can comfortably say that a lot of industries would have adopted the digital route. And travel, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the industries that's typically very, very open and responsive to adoption of new technology. So I think we'd be in a far, far better state than we are today.
Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Utpal very much for giving us his thoughts.